My name is Kim McCleary. I'm Director of Strategic Initiatives for Faster Cures. Faster Cures is a center of the Milken Institute based in Washington, D.C., and we work across diseases with all the stakeholders in the biomedical and healthcare delivery ecosystems to identify and break down barriers that add time and expense to the process of getting promising therapies from the lab to patients who need them. Today, we're going to focus on one of those barriers, and that's the traditional lack of patient input into the process of developing and delivering therapies. And if you attended the panel this morning, the bipartisan quest for cures that our Executive Director Margaret Anderson moderated and Dr. Francis Collins participated on, you heard Sarah Radcliffe mention this need for patient perspectives and the informed patient voice to be part of the priority setting that will really help catapult innovation. I'm joined by 5 tremendous partners today working to bring patient voices more into the center of the drug development and delivery process. Tony Coles, who's CEO of Humanity, Lou DeGennaro, who's President and CEO of the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, Bray Patrick Lake, who's Director of Stakeholder Engagement for the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, Mace Rothenberg, who's the Chief Medical Officer and Head of Pfizer's Oncology business, and Joe Selby, who's Executive Director of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. Before I turn the program over to my colleagues, I'd like to set the stage for you, and I had a few visuals that would have added to this, but we can all use our imaginations. Imagine the year is 1973. We're in the midst of the Vietnam War. Watergate is on the front page of every newspaper and every news magazine. And that summer, there was a little match, the Battle of the Sexes, that even illustrated how cultural roles were changing even on the tennis court. And Billie Jean King, hashtag better for women. Thank you, sister. At the same time, in 1973, there was also something issued by the American Hospital Association, the Patient's Bill of Rights. And if you think about that era, in that time, patients didn't expect that they would be told what their diagnosis was, that they would have any voice in the healthcare that was delivered to them, and that they would be partners with their doctors in determining what healthcare they would be participating in. So this Patient Bill of Rights, this revolutionary document, and it was very revolutionary, asserted that patients had certain rights in their care, but not in research. In research, there were really 2 ways that patients could participate. They could give blood or they could give money. And Mike Milken spoke to this morning when he said, in his lifetime as a patient advocate, the first 22 and a half years he spent sponsoring research and being a patron of research. And the second 22 and a half years, he's been active in the research process, and he encouraged all of us to get active in that process. Well, in many ways, in most ways, Mike Milken is ahead of the rest of us, so it's taken the system a little bit of time to catch up. But now we're in this age where patients are really active participants, not only in their care, but in the research that determines what care they have access to. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists just to give us a quick soundbite about the way this shift has affected their roles in the process. And I'm going to start with Bray. And Bray comes to this as a patient herself and through the work that she does with Citi and many other organizations.
Yeah, so probably most importantly, so I'm Bray Patrick Lake. I was a patient in a clinical trial in 2008 that was actually aborted for low and slow enrollment. I had never heard of research or clinical trial before that, and I actually have a master's in forensic science. So I come from a sciencey background, and I knew nothing about research until all of a sudden I had a health crisis that just dropped me right into needing answers and care. And there were just so many issues with the system, and I really started to say, patients aren't getting what they need out of the system. How do we change it, and how do we make it work for us? And what I would like to leave you all with is that today the door is wide open for patients. I literally went from knowing nothing about research to being a co-chair for the advisory committee to the NIH director for precision medicine. And I think that if you can get educated about the issues and learn the landscape and really think of solutions and what we can all do together, there's a real opportunity to participate.
Joe, I'm going to go next to you. So you were a physician, family physician at Kaiser, and a researcher in a lot of chronic and also acute disease. And now you're the executive director of something called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. Why?
So I'll be very honest. As I was leaving Kaiser Permanente, where I'd been an outcomes researcher for 27 years, and pursuing the bright ideas of clinicians within Kaiser Permanente, of the NIH and ARC and other federal funders, of pharmaceutical companies who would come to us to do research, of the health plan with which Kaiser is associated with. My boss, a wonderful guy, said to me, you know, it's kind of funny. Here you've been doing research for 27 years, and the underlying theme of it, if we could just make the doctors happier, if we could just make it easier on the physicians, the patients would be, and the members would be so satisfied. So from a completely doctor-centered environment, you're going off to a place called the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And so I smiled, but even I didn't have the sense until I got to DC and met up with the board, and they'd been thinking about this for 9 months. What does it in fact mean to make research patient-centered? It certainly had not been in any way. Our board had the wisdom to say that its mission was to conduct and disseminate research that helped answer the questions of patients and clinicians and others. But they added a line that was nowhere in the legislation, and it said, guided by patients, their caregivers, clinicians, and others in the healthcare community. So they initiated the notion of engagement and involvement of patients, and I'll give a few examples of how that's affected us and things I've noticed that are worth sharing. But I will just say that what we were most surprised was by meeting up with the patient communities, organizations, and individuals who were more than prepared to step in. And they have made all the difference within PCORI. There's just no doubt about the fact that it's a very different slant on research. Once you try it, you don't go back. And I'm delighted that it's moving now into PCORI operates almost exclusively in the post-approval, real-world clinical delivery space. Delighted that these same notions are being brought through a variety of pressures and initiatives into the drug development space. It makes all the sense in the world.
Great. Mace, I'm going to turn to you next. You're head of Pfizer's oncology business. You're also a practicing clinician and took care of patients for years. Mm-hmm. How are you seeing this shift play out in terms of both the business imperatives and your work still with patients directly?
Well, 30 years ago when I started my training in medical oncology, the fashion of the day was to give a higher dose chemotherapy and bone marrow transplantation. The idea being higher doses cured more cancer cells in the laboratory. We were just limited by how high a dose we can give to patients. And over the course of 10 years, we realized that with the exception of a few hematologic malignancies, the use of really high-dose chemotherapy and stem cell transplantation really didn't move the needle in solid tumors. Those are things that we were doing to the patient. If you fast forward 30 years, it really has turned around and made patient really truly the center of what we do, whether we're talking about the genomic profile of that patient's cancer that helps us identify actionable mutations or alterations, whether you look at the patient's immune system being able to harness something that exists normally in the patient but somehow prevented from recognizing and killing the cancer, being able to now see just tremendous advances based on harnessing that potential. But also taking it one step beyond that and really looking to see what the patient's experience has been, patient-reported outcomes. And from a position now in industry, getting a drug approved by regulatory agencies is not the finish line. You have to demonstrate its value to the patient. What did the patient experience as a result of that therapy that the existing therapies couldn't provide? So I've seen a tremendous evolution, and we can get into a lot of the other variations about what's happened as well in terms of patient advocacy organizations being able to link together different organizations from government, from the private sector, to be able to create coalitions that really allow us to deliver the kind of therapies that patients are looking for today.
Great. Lou, I'm going to ask you, as president and CEO of Leukemia Lymphoma Society, which is one of the most forward-thinking venture philanthropy organizations representing the needs of patients, how has this shift affected your organization?
Thank you, Kim. I think what I'll do is tell you a little bit of a story in the lore of drug discovery and drug development for the hematological malignancies, as Mace called them, the blood cancers. I'll set the stage for you. In 1998, Leukemia and Lymphoma Society funded investigator Brian Drucker in Portland, Oregon, had very compelling data that suggested that a novel first-in-class drug called a tyrosine kinase inhibitor could be very effective at treating a rare type of leukemia called chronic myeloid leukemia. At the same time, in Basel, Switzerland, Dan Vasella, the CEO of Novartis, and his team were wrestling with whether to invest additional dollars into the manufacturing of supplies of this drug. And the challenge that they were facing was the less than good economics in developing a drug for a patient population that was only 4,000 new patients a year. Enter Susan Mcnamara. Susan was diagnosed with CML in 1998. She immediately was put on a course of the then standard therapy, hydroxyurea and interferon, two drugs that are not particularly effective and have severe life-altering side effects. She was given a 3-year life expectancy. Susan was 31 at the time, 31 years old. She was scared, without options, obviously very concerned about her health, and began to use what was in 1998 a new tool for discovery, the internet. She used it to learn about Dr. Drucker's results. She used it to connect with other patients. She reached out to, when interferon failed her, she reached out to Dr. Drucker to get on his trial of this drug then called STI 571. And Dr. Drucker told her that the trial had closed because there was no more drug supply. So Susan took it upon herself to activate the patient community and the physicians of those patients to generate a petition. That petition went off to Novartis. It caught the attention of Dr. Vasella, who made the decision to lean in, have Novartis lean in, provide substantial resources to the generation of additional drug. 2.5 weeks after that petition was received, Susan got a letter from Novartis saying that Dr. Drucker would have drug supply and would be able to reopen the trial in 2 months. So fast forward to today, STI 571, now known as Gleevec, has saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of patients. It's now approved for 10 indications, including some solid tumors. And from a business standpoint, since this is the Milken Conference, last year alone, it sold a little over $4 billion worth of drug for Novartis. So there's a perfect example of how patients can weigh in to push the direction of drug discovery in one direction or another.
Great. Thank you. Tony, last but not least, certainly your experience as CEO of Onyx, which was active in the oncology space, and now with humanity looking at some different diseases, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. How do you see this broadening out beyond the very well-connected cancer community to populations that may not have the same kind of infrastructure and leadership as an LLS or organizations like that?
Well, I'll start my comments with just a quick observation. There have been 3 major trends that have supported or buoyed this shift that Mace and Joe talked about a moment ago. I'll start with the one that they spoke to, which was kind of the power physicians had. There was a doctrine of the learned intermediary when I started in the pharmaceutical industry, which essentially gave physicians the utilitarian and authoritarian right to make decisions on behalf of patients. Now, fast forward 25 years, and here we are. That sounds Byzantine. It sounds bizarre. And it's because there's been this increase, well, let's call it an inversion of the medical decision-making pyramid. Whereas physicians were at the base, we've now inverted it, flipped it on its head, and patients are indeed at the base. And that's only because of the rise in consumerism, which extends far beyond retail devices or iPhones or social media or any of those things that we do for the day-to-day management of our personal lives. It's actually been brought by the power of the internet and the availability of information to patients as decision makers. So this rise in consumerism is the second. And the third is the rise in social justice or social causes or social platforms, if you will, where individuals take it upon themselves to just go and not just get the answers, which is the consumer piece, but go and literally do something fundamentally different that's never been done before. You've heard the story that Lou's told you. Many of you know John Crowley, who has now been celebrated in the Hollywood film Extraordinary Measures. Father, a Harvard Business School graduate whose 2 of 3 children were born with a very rare disease that would have and should have killed them by the age of 6. And John took it upon himself as a Harvard Business School graduate to go out and find the funding, start a company, and search for a therapeutic for his kids. So even if you don't have the means or the resources of a Harvard Business School graduate degree or an access to the highest reaches of the capital markets, I will tell you that one of the most heartwarming things that I've ever witnessed was a recent FDA hearing that was around the approval process or approval discussion for a new drug for multiple myeloma, which is a very deadly blood cancer. Nearly a dozen patients came to Washington, to the FDA, and stood in a queue behind a microphone to make their individual case. And the best example for me, the one that burns in my memory, was a 70-some-odd-year-old South Asian and woman of Indian descent who said, thanks to this medication, I am no longer afraid of my disease. Please approve this therapy so I can make the choice to take this for my own benefit. Now, that's a long way from the doctrine of the learned intermediary.
That's a poignant example of exactly the shift that we're seeing. It's not just these systems around us, but patients' expectations for their care have changed immeasurably, and this rise of the informed consumer is really powering it. If I could have slide number 7.
I think there would be no slide, sorry.
Then not that we don't have. Well, there we are. This point, early in these conversations, you'd hear about the patient perspective as if this was a monolithic thing that all patients would agree on what they wanted for their care. And what we at Faster Cures are sort of trying to bring to the conversation is there's a whole continuum of expectations. We have a very short clip from a recent PBS documentary series that the Leukemia Lymphoma Society helped support and that has really, I think, brought this story to an important audience, and we'll share it with you. The next slide, I think, is the video, so if you could roll that. Or maybe not.
Do you feel like at this point, after everything that you've gone through in the last couple months, and we were to have to really think about chemotherapy, you'd be wanting to do that again, or you're not sure?
I'd probably be wanting to.
You'd be willing to try it?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Some people, they need to do everything that they can do that is possible to be done to stay on this earth.
They can still say, I love this life. I love being alive. I love being here, and I will do anything to stay.
For some patients, it is a war. Their experience of it is a war, and to say that it isn't is to deny them their reality. It is a war for them. And yet for other patients, they don't want to fight. But it's not the language of defeat. It is the language of negotiation. It is the language of what to do next, given the circumstances.
So, Mace, Pfizer has recently named one of its leaders, Dr. Rosalind Snyder, as the Global Patient Officer. And that's a tremendous commitment from one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies to really put the patient in the center of your operations. Tell us how that's playing out at Pfizer.
So I think historically in pharma or biotech, you really are around the target, the mechanism of action, and the disease, and you're really looking for something that gives you a signal. And once you find that, then you really try and refine that and see, do you have a drug here? And then once you do see that certain threshold level of activity, then how do you move it forward in a responsible and rapid manner to be able to make it to the market? Nowhere in that process is the patient's view being taken into account. It really is later on when you're designing the phase 3 pivotal trial where you say, in order to really have that strong value proposition, we better put some patient-reported outcomes in here, or it used to be quality of life. But there was a real paradox about that as well, because so much of what we do in a pivotal trial is designed to make sure that it is adequate, if successful, to garner regulatory approval. And we know that the FDA had never found a quality of life tool that met all of its requirements to be able to meet its standards and allow that to be put in the label. So there's a paradox here. Why put it in if it's not really going to help us? And I think we've now evolved past that, recognizing that, again, the FDA approval is one step, but then you have to have something from the patient that tells you, from the patient's perspective, how did this drug impact them? And you realize then that putting this in late in the course of development of a drug is not optimal. You really have to build it in much earlier, because that can inform you in terms of whether you have a drug that may have the kind of therapeutic activity you're looking for, but is really going to have to overcome some significant challenges if patients are going to use this. And you know, Pfizer unfortunately had that very experience, not in oncology, but in diabetes. Pfizer years ago brought forward, after many years of research, many millions of dollars of investment, an inhalable insulin. Now, being able to deliver insulin any other way than by injection was considered a great victory. The problem was, two problems. Number one, it didn't replace injected insulin. And number two, the device was really unwieldy. So you really didn't get what you were hoping for, and that is replacing the injection. They still had to take the injection, and they had this big contraption, which, you know, teenagers and young adults don't want people to know they have diabetes, and it's hard to manage this. So that was just a commercial failure, because the company didn't take in a patient perspective. So I think with naming Roz Schneider as the new head of global patient affairs is really a step in the direction of saying, let's think at the very time that we have a drug that we think may have a future in development, what does that mean to the patient? What is going to be meaningful to the patient? How do we capture that in a prospective manner? And actually, what kind of signs and signals can we get from that that can help inform the design of subsequent and pivotal clinical trials? It may be things, very likely will be things that we didn't think of or we didn't prioritize as we should. So this is one step of bringing the patient's voice and the patient's view into drug development, and I think it's a really positive one.
Great. So if we could have slide 11, please. Companies, and as May said, regulators are really thinking hard about this question of patient-centered drug development, and it begs the question of whether patients have what they need to be equipped to participate in this process, to fulfill the expectations that are growing about them being partners. And to this end, as we heard this morning, in January, President Obama launched the Precision Medicine Initiative, and Dr. Francis Collins, who's with us here, announced that one of the key strategies to building up this precision medicine initiative is to build a cohort of 1 million patients and to engage them as partners in research and equip them to be active participants. We have a short clip, the next slide, from the president's address, and you can hear it best from him.
Doctors have always recognized that every patient is unique. And doctors have always tried to tailor their treatments as best they can to individuals. You can match a blood transfusion to a blood type. That was an important discovery. What if matching a cancer cure to our genetic code was just as easy, just as standard? What if figuring out the right dose of medicine was as simple as taking our temperature? And that's the promise of precision medicine. Delivering the right treatments at the right time, every time, to the right person. And for a small but growing number of patients, that future is already here. 8 out of 10 people with one type of leukemia saw white blood cell counts return to normal with a new drug targeting a specific gene. Genetic testing for HIV patients helps doctors determine who will be helped by a new antiviral drug and who will experience harmful side effects. And advances in technology means these breakthroughs could be just the beginning.
So Dr. Francis Collins, in addition to riding a Harley and playing a mean guitar, had the wisdom to select 2 of our panelists to be on his NIH Advisory Council for the Precision Medicine Initiative. And in fact, Bray is his co-chair, and Tony will serve with about 20 other experts. I'm going to ask both of you, what's the challenge of mobilizing 1 million patients in this role, this new role?
Well, you know, from the earlier comments, you know, I hold a belief that patients speak to us. They can either tell us directly that they've got side effects or that they're having a problem or that they've got a set of symptoms or they want to choose a new drug. This is a great opportunity to have 1 million current and future patients speak to us, but not quite in the traditional way, been in a conversation, but actually to let their medical histories, to let their genomes, to let their symptomatology, their environmental factors, their lifestyle factors speak to us in a way that we've never been able to do before. We've got individual understanding. The president talked about what happens in cancer in particular. We've got the greatest understanding about the connection of either an individual's genome or a tumor genome and the best treatments to identify for the treatment of those diseases. We're now just on the cutting edge of doing the same thing for many of the neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diseases like those. But how many, if we fast forward diseases in 10 or 15 years, how many new insights could we gain if we understood today what the genomic makeup of an individual patient or future patient or citizen of this country or of the world could tell us about their disease? And that's what this initiative hopes to do. We plan to enroll 1 million, a cohort of 1 million people across the United States and collect a variety of data and use the electronic health records to link all of this and in a big data analysis unlock some of the secrets of individual patient decision making. Bray?
Yeah, so call me crazy, but I don't think it's going to be hard at all to enroll 1 million people if we actually create a system that users want to be part of, which we've really kind of left that out of healthcare to date. I think also we really have to rise up and tackle the big challenges. We have done one-offs, we have duct taped, we have paper clipped, we have stuck things together. We have said, we know what we need to do, but it's too hard. And patients are really tired of that. We know what we want from the healthcare system. And we're not getting it. And so then what do? We go on Facebook, we aggregate, we create a foundation, we go off and we create a new system over here. And again, it's siloed and it's not linked. And all of us need to be working together to achieve maximum results. There's no one partner in this entity that can do what we need to do alone. And I think it is really time to just whiteboard and start with the vision. This opening session this morning with Dr. Soon Xiang, I was sitting there going, yeah, I want that. And I know it's possible. It's not that we can't do it, it's that we aren't doing it. I spent last week printing up medical records and taking them from my cardiologist to my interventional cardiologist, who's then going to scan them and turn them into a PDF, and they're not going to be anywhere in my medical record. My neurologist charged me $50 administrative fee to actually process all the paperwork I'd picked up, which might actually be illegal, I'm not sure. And then I went and I talked to my patients on my Facebook group to see if their outcomes were similar to mine and asked them for advice on what to do next, because I'm not getting what I need out of the healthcare system. And it's so ridiculous because we know through technology, we know what's possible. And then you look at our clinical trial system and it's as bureaucratic and bogged down, and it takes, a zillion years to launch a study. It costs way more money than we know it ever should. And then the studies fail. So half of them don't even enroll, probably more than half, and then we actually don't produce any results. And if we do get results, we don't bother to share them. So we're starting with the broken system, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity, but we have to build trust. We have to share information. We have to share data. And it's an open science type of system and mindset, and that's what we really need to go after with this precision medicine initiative.
Thanks. We have the next slide. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We heard at lunchtime former Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Paulson, talk about the burden of healthcare on the system and on the economy. And one of the other elements that's driving patient engagement and the rise of the consumer is that patients are taking more of they're paying more of the share of the cost of their healthcare than they used to. And the Leukemia Lymphoma Society has really pioneered the concept of bringing patients' perspectives into medical coverage decisions, reimbursement decisions, and how insurers and payers are thinking about what they're willing to pay for. Lou, do you want to share a little bit of that with us?
I will, but before I do that, I want to come back to the precision medicine piece for just a minute, because I think there's, by extension, if we carry the cancer theme a little bit further, It shows some interesting directions for the future. About a year and a half ago, perhaps 2 years ago, there were a series of 3 articles in the New York Times that described the cancer journey of 3 patients. And ironically for me, one was a leukemia patient, one was a lymphoma patient, and one was a patient with a rare ocular tumor of the eye. But the theme that came out of it when you read those 3 articles was, in each case, the patient had access to cutting-edge molecular technology that allowed the physicians, the treating physicians, to identify the driver mutation in each of the patient's cancers. And it turned out there was a drug on the shelf, not necessarily approved for that disease, but approved for a different disease, that was known to block the activity of those driver mutations. And when those drugs were repurposed and used in these patients, in each case, the patient saw a great benefit. So if you fast forward that a little bit, what it tells you in the cancer space anyway is that at some point in the not too distant future, I'd like to think that we get to a place where we no longer think about the tissue of origin of the cancer, breast, colon, blood, but we think about the driver mutations. And we're actually enrolling clinical trials based on what those driver mutations are, so that we're looking for drugs that are specific in that way. On the reimbursement side, clearly this is an issue for the patient. You can't pick up the newspaper these days without seeing something about the high cost of cancer drugs. And we know that this is having an impact on patients and patient care, on the quality of life of patients. I mentioned Gleevec earlier. Let's stay on that theme for a minute. President Obama mentioned it. In the clinical trial setting, 80% of newly diagnosed CML patients who receive Gleevec have a successful 5-year survival. And frankly, they go on far longer than that. But if you look at the real-world statistics in the United States, it's only about 50% 5-year survival. So what's the difference? 90% in the clinical trial setting, 50% in the real world. When you begin to investigate this, it's clearly in and around compliance. And part of the issue in compliance is the cost of the drugs. Gleevec today costs $90,000 for an annual course, and patients frequently pay a co-insurance. And I'll give you an example. If you're in the Medicare donut hole, that co-insurance is 20%. Well, I know I'd have difficulty meeting a bill of 20% of $90,000 a year, and so do other patients. And so we have to look in a concerted way at this issue. We've been instrumental in bringing patients' voice to the FDA, to the industry, and to legislators. And some of the results of that are what's been read out recently in the 21st Century Cures Act, looking at reforming how we develop drugs, making it faster and hopefully less expensive.
That's the hope.
Mm-hmm.
Slide 15, please. In terms of the regulatory environment, and that's what allows us to make those choices, getting drugs beyond the FDA and that they're safe and effective when used as directed, that the benefits outweigh the risks of those medicines. FDA, particularly in oncology, has been all about progression-free survival and certain counts in the blood work. But we are seeing a shift even in terms of what the oncology reviewers are looking for. They want to know that the drug has some impact on the way the patient feels or functions. And so, Bray, how is that changing the way clinical trials are designed? You're at Citi, and you're bringing the patient voice in, and
well, yeah, I think so. We're seeing this paradigm shift. So even when we started going to patient-reported outcome. Just because it's patient-reported doesn't mean it's patient-centered, because there's a good chance that somebody actually, in isolation of the patients, decided that this is what we were going to measure without actually ever talking to a patient group and saying, is this what's most meaningful to your patient community? I think we saw a little of that on April 1st at the FDA Compendium Workshop for Clinical Outcomes Assessment. They were rolling out a compendium tool. And so they were showing, what were the existing PROs, and then some of us from the patient community said, well, how many of those were actually developed in partnership with patients, and we know that these are meaningful endpoints. And there was kind of like a silence. And we know that the groups are doing it. So Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, I think, is an excellent example. Obviously, Lou's group is cutting edge, but we're seeing more and more that patient groups are really taking the reins and saying, these are the benefits, these are the risks, this is how we're going to work through this framework of patient preference, which the Medical Device Innovation Consortium will be bringing forward a new framework on May 13th. So keep your eyes out for that. But I think there's, patients are able to come to the table and really say this is what's important, and then hopefully the hypothesis is that we'll see people that have better adherence, better compliance, better follow through, and better adoption and uptake of some of the research that we've been working on.
If I could just follow up on that, because a lot of these things happen or don't happen in the setting of clinical trials, but there's also organizations that exist to really help there be a dialogue among patients, and that can be tremendously helpful and valuable for sponsors. So the cancer support community supports the Cancer Experience Registry. Leukemia and Lymphoma Society is also a supporter. Pfizer's a supporter as well. It has more than 7,000 patients who are registered. And what they do is they share their experience online. And by sharing that experience, number one, you're not alone. You're not unusual in this regard. There are other people who've experienced exactly what you have. And there's a tremendous sense of comfort in knowing that. And then the support that you get by whether you change something or you're at least more aware of what to watch out for in the future, it really does benefit those individuals. But it actually allows this organization to gather together information from an unprecedented number of individuals and then begin to share that with not only patients but also the sponsors so that we know what's getting in the way of optimal utilization of our drugs. Because as Lou pointed out, the drug can have great effect, but if patients aren't taking it, it's not going to benefit them. So it really is a virtuous cycle by supporting this and really expanding this.
So that's a perfect segue to my next question for Joe, and if we could show the next slide, 16. PCORI is the first research institute sort of created in this environment of the engaged patient and the empowered consumer. And you have this slogan, research done differently, trying to mobilize patients in much the same way that the Precision Medicine Initiative will. How's it working out?
Well, I'd say it's working out better even than we might have anticipated. When we say research done differently, we mean that we go to patients and other stakeholders as well, but we go to patients to get the questions that we need to research. And invariably, very often they do point us to treatments that address symptoms that were not studied as the drugs were coming on the market now. And in the other case, they push us, and this is not exactly our fit, they really do press on us the need for new treatments, particularly in rare diseases and diseases for which there's no treatment. But they join us on prioritization panels. They join us on the merit review or study sections that review applications. Researchers must join with patients and other stakeholders on the research teams. We're beginning now to get reports. There was a very nice systematic review recently about research that engaged patients on the research team. They change the questions. They change the study design. They participate in the analyses. They participate in interpreting the findings. Two examples, just to sort of wrap this up. From PCORI's point of view, we tend to hold multi-stakeholder work groups when there's a topic of a lot of interest. Two of them that we held recently, one was on new therapies for hepatitis C, and one was on the biologic therapies for multiple sclerosis. So back to the hepatitis C example, we all, and the purpose was to identify the key research questions that PCORI could fund in post-marketing research, post-approval research. And so everybody agreed that comparative effectiveness of the new therapies would be very valuable, that we'd really like to know if these were genuinely equivalent treatments, these new treatments. Then came the question, so insurers, their perspective, and it's always their perspective, we must have the evidence. So insurers were very supportive of a trial that would pit immediate therapy with a new agent to what most insurers currently cover, which is we'll risk stratify you, we will treat those of you who are at most risk, and we'll watchfully wait and retest the rest of you. And they suggested a rigorous randomized trial with all the patient-centered outcomes would be the very best approach. Interestingly, pharma joined. Pharma was very well represented at this meeting. All the manufacturers of hepatitis C drugs were at the meeting, and they tended to support that as well. I think probably because they believe, well, our products will win. Our products will be better. For a lot of outcomes, they'll be better, so let's go for it. Patients stood up to a person and said, no way. We have seen the preliminary data. We've seen the efficacy data. We're convinced these drugs are really quite safe. We'll take our chances, and they are extraordinarily effective. I would like to be without hepatitis C. There's no way we would sign on to a randomized trial. So you will see our funding announcement, which is closed now, and we're going through the process, but PCORI is putting a lot of money into post-approval research on hepatitis C drugs, but there is not a randomized treatment of immediate therapy versus watchful waiting. We're going to try to do some observationally to see if we can learn something from the populations that are still getting exposed to watchful waiting, but we are not randomizing. Patient voice. Fast forward a couple months, multiple sclerosis meeting. Patients essentially said, look, there are 12 new costly biologics in multiple sclerosis. They've all been shown to reduce the progression of plaque on MRI, and they've all been shown in relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. They've been shown to slow the rate of relapse in multiple sclerosis. But nobody has ever bothered to see, how do they do for my pain? How do they do for my immobility? How do they do for my fuzzy thinking? How do they do for my fatigue? How about my depression? They simply have not been studied head-to-head or in any other way. No one has published data on which of these might work for which symptoms. The community of patients with multiple sclerosis really identifies by their primary symptom or symptoms. And so what works for whom and which of these biologics might have some actual benefit in terms of symptoms is a completely open question. Patient perspective, that's what I want to know. I think it speaks a lot to drug development too. I think drug development is going to get pushed toward actually developing drugs that affect a different set of outcomes.
Great. The panel was very egalitarian and very united in its view that we wanted to open the conversation to the room and not just stick to the panelists here. And I see a brave soul starting out.
Just a question on the very topic you talked about, which is the concept of, comparative trials on one hand, if you would, or placebo versus active drug. At some point, the patient advocates, by definition, would like to always be certain that if they're going to be in a trial, they're going to get the active drug. The FDA has absolutely embraced and appears to continue to embrace the concept of, if you would, placebo-controlled trials as opposed to just open label or however you want to describe it. How do you all as a group feel about this? How far do you take the issue of representing the patient? Because if I were the patient, I want to make darn sure I was getting the active drug.
Yeah, I could start. Whenever a clinical trial is begun, in order for it to be ethical, you have to have clinical equipoise. You have to make sure that if you're going to be participating as a patient or as a physician, that whichever arm the patient's randomized to, you feel in good conscience that that is a very reasonable choice. There have been a number of trials over the years where there has been strong belief that the investigational therapy was far superior, and even doing the clinical trial was unethical, and that perception turned out to be wrong. So sometimes these clinical trials are necessary. Having said that, especially in the area that we're entering now in precision medicine, if you have a particular driver mutation or abnormality, like the ALK translocation in non-small cell lung cancer, that really marks you for having a very high likelihood of response to that therapy. And in fact, the FDA has been very receptive to the idea that you may not need a randomized trial in every situation to identify drugs that are helpful to patients. And in fact, the drug that targeted that, crizotinib Xalkori, was approved based on a single-arm, non-randomized trial. Now, there had to be subsequent randomized trials that were done to confirm that, but I think what we're seeing now is that as we get more experience with this and knowing what's a driver mutation versus what's a bystander or a passenger mutation, we're recognizing that in some situations there may be an opportunity to get full approval based on the results of a single-arm trial. So I think that the FDA is not necessarily the bad guy here. I think it's the fact that there are situations where the difference in the improvement may not be that obvious, and you really need a randomized trial in order to put that question to rest. But again, keeping the patient's interest in focus, more and more trials are acknowledging the fact that if the patient is randomized to the control arm and then develops disease progression, they can switch over and receive the investigational drug. That makes it a little more difficult to interpret longer outcomes like overall survival in cancer, but it does give that patient the opportunity to receive that drug.
Kim, can I? Go ahead.
Real quick. Excellent question, and I agree that I think a lot is being done with ethics in mind, as well as rapid approval in the pre-approval space. But it just makes the point that you get approval, and if you put a genuine CER head-to-head study in the pre-approval space, that would lengthen the time. I mean, the differences are likely to be small. That would lengthen the time to approval. So it just makes the point that once drugs get approved, and it's probably better that more drugs get approved, we do the comparative studies in clinical settings after they're approved. Not only do we, it's not so much that we find out which one actually is really better, it's much more that we find out, as part of precision medicine, which one works better for whom. So those are really probably studies better done post-approval.
And yeah, I was just going to build on to this particular point. You know, in addition to the kind of clinical trial standards point that's been made, in the absence of a biomarker, which actually should lead to sometimes single-arm studies, in the peri-approval process, there is an opportunity for compassionate use or expanded access to these therapies, so before they are approved. It doesn't necessarily aid the patient who might otherwise be eligible at the time of phase 2, because this does occur a little bit later, but there are ways to actually try to accelerate the availability on an as-needed basis to patients. One of the things we've fought very hard for from the industry side of things is to compress the time to approval. And we're very grateful that now there are accelerated pathways for review and approval. The breakthrough therapy legislation that was approved several years ago now gives us an opportunity to designate certain products that really do need, in hyperspeed fashion, to be reviewed at the FDA and provided to patients. So I think that's one of the best examples, legislatively and practically, that patients have really pushed the agenda here.
So I heard your comment and question completely differently. I heard it in the sense that we needed to make sure that we are designing studies in partnership with the stakeholders. So the patients as the honest broker and the patient group, also clinicians, because if you don't have the buy-in and the understanding about why a placebo-controlled trial is necessary from the get-go, you're going to have problems enrolling, and then even if you do enroll, your patients are actually going to go online, and then we're going to say, I'm on the yellow capsule, you're on the purple capsule, and people actually undo them and try to figure out which arm they're in, and they undermine the study completely. Absolutely, and it's going on regularly, and people, they turn a blind eye, and we think that we don't need new study designs and that, we don't have technology. We still have, policies that were created before the internet. We have this whole system that was created before the internet, and people are sharing in real time about, live tweeting their trials. So we need to think about those things.
You're nodding.
I might as well pile on.
Yeah.
We run a clinical trial matching service out of our office. We have a hotline that patients call. We service about 60, 80,000 calls a year. Many of them ask about clinical trials. We help them navigate the trials that they might be eligible for. But I think more importantly, we educate them about what clinical trials are, because patients don't understand that. And I think even more importantly, how to have a conversation with their physician about getting on a clinical trial. All of those pieces need to come together in order for a patient to make a thoughtful decision about whether to join a trial and what type of trial as well.
Another question, the front row.
What are your thoughts on the dilemma, if you will, on healthcare cost? Comes to, for instance, it costs so much for a pharmaceutical company to develop a new drug, or it costs so much for a pharmaceutical company to develop a new drug or acquire companies that have developed new drugs, and yet healthcare costs are out of control. How do you deal with that dilemma of ultimately getting the product to the consumers at a reasonable cost?
Well, I'll start, and Bray and I may be on the opposite side of this particular conversation, but I will say that we're actually not having the conversation we really need to have. So we've chosen to focus on specific elements of the healthcare dollar, if you will, so at the 100% level. and have really drilled down on the most obvious and the most glaring in some ways from a cost point of view, mostly because of the design of our insurance system, which was all an artifact of the 1945 post-GI era. So let's go back to how we got to where we are in the construction of that. In that debate, which I'll argue is only half of the conversation, we're not really having the conversation around either system cost savings, total savings, and or benefit to the patient, and we are largely ignoring the other elements of the healthcare dollar. So I might actually suggest that we really do need a different dialogue around every aspect of the healthcare dollar, the value it derives, if you will, and brings, and how we can actually rationally talk through the benefit that therapies, therapeutic devices, and pharmaceuticals actually do bring in improving outcome overall. I think it's a really hard one-off question to take.
So I would say, how much do clinical trials really cost? So we set up these clinical trial infrastructures, we break them down when we're done so nobody else actually drives on the road. Like, I think about what if we went from door to door every morning to see who has school-age children that we could then take to school, and we started our day with that every day. There are a number of inefficiencies in the system, and we know it, and what do? We keep doing the same thing over and over, and we might one-off it, and we might Band-Aid it, we might make an incremental change. So we have electronic medical records that they're not interoperable. We don't have a lot of data standards. We can't use the data we have. We have all this promise and all these things that didn't quite do what they were supposed to do. And personally, that's why I think it's costing so much. And as the patient, it's very frustrating because we know that it shouldn't be $2.2 billion to develop a new drug. We could actually do that much more efficiently. And then hopefully the money wouldn't be going back into profit, but would go back into R&D, and we would have even more therapies available to patients.
So, of all the things that drive costs, one of them, just one of them, is the cost of clinical trials and drug development. PCORI has made a major investment. Others have made major investments as well, but PCORI has made a really major investment in something called PCORNet, which is an attempt to build a clinical data infrastructure based on electronic health records linked to health claims that involves patients, but also delivery systems and health plans in the governance of the network. And why that's, I mean, this is pretty much at this point, PCORI built it to do, again, post-approval research. But if you think about it a bit, it's quite an attractive notion to think that if health systems get involved in asking and answering questions along with their patients, it could, and if among the funders of this research are industry, pharmaceutical and device manufacturers, it's quite intriguing. I get intrigued by the thought that we might at someday sit down at the table together and say, in this infrastructure we've built, what pre-approval trials do we all favor, do we all support? And have we explored the different system implications? I really agree with Tony about the sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul in the healthcare delivery system. But this notion, bringing trials back to the states, embedding them to the extent possible in care delivery, and having buy-in at the beginning of the study on the importance of the study.
So here we are in 2015. We heard this morning from the panel on the bipartisan quest for cures about the 21st Century Cures Initiative that's playing out on the House side of the Congress. We've got the Senate mobilizing to look at innovation and how to spur innovation on the Senate side, and hopefully the two houses of Congress can come together and pass some legislation that enables us. We've seen in the first draft of the House legislation that bringing patient perspectives to the core of drug development and delivery is their #1 priority. We've got a new cycle of user fees gearing up this summer that will, I think, for at least the trade organizations and many of the member companies, put patients at the center, at the top of the priority list. I'm going to give each of you the opportunity for just a lightning round of what's the future perfect look like 5 years from now when we come together for Global in the year 2020? What are we going to be talking about in terms of the roles of patients and how they shape this environment? Tony, I'll start with you.
You know, I think it'll build off the earlier comments. I think we will be surprised at what patients in the aggregate will tell us. If we create the kind of success in this 1 million person cohort that we've talked about, I think we'll see patterns of information and data that will really enhance our understanding. And it will all be at the micro level because one person signed up to participate that aggregated. So I think the power of big data is going to inform us. I think there will be a significant trend in the coalition of technology and healthcare delivery that will also give us lots of information and perspective at the individual level and then at the group level, because we'll be collecting data on a real-time basis from either wearables or other tech-based devices that will also enhance our decision-making. So 5 years, I think it's technology, and I think it's the outcome of, or at least the interim results of this 1 million patient cohort.
Great. I'm going to keep you all awake and go to Joe next.
Oh, right. Well, I think technology is going to play a big role, but I hope there's a culture change too that accompanies it and maybe even leads it, because I do think I was reminded of the three treasurers talking over the noon hour about kind of our dysfunction, and you know, we have to help dysfunction here, that people kind of say the same things over and over again at meetings. I think there's real power at bringing all the stakeholders together with patients in the room and saying, in the name of patients, you know, what's the important next step here? So I hope that we see culture change even as we harness the technologies of electronic health records on a mass basis and of mobile devices and other novel ways of collecting information. I'd love to see us be a little less adversarial 5 years from now.
Lou?
So I consider myself a fiduciary for the 1 million blood cancer patients in the United States. And what I know is they want therapies, they want cures, and they want them as quickly as possible. So I think that we, and the second point I'd make is that I know that there's value in innovation. There are, if you count since the year 2000, the number of new cancer drugs approved by the FDA, it's about 65 new drugs. 40% of them were approved first in a blood cancer and then went on to be useful in treating other cancers and even other diseases. There's great value in innovation. Blood cancer survival rates, depending on the disease, have doubled, tripled, quadrupled. So in the debate around pricing, in the debate around FDA reform, I think I want to be certain that in the near term we don't lose sight of the value of innovation, and that we continue to put support where we need to continue to drive the innovation and research so that we get those therapies for patients.
Great. Mace?
I think we're going to see new coalitions leading to more productive collaborations. We're going to see not only pharmaceutical companies partnering with academic medical centers, we're going to see patient advocacy organizations and patients and government organizations really getting around the table much earlier and recognizing what each brings to the table. And as you said earlier, Kim, the patients are going to be asked to give more than just the blood and their consent and their money. They're going to be asked to give their ideas and their suggestions and their investment. There are a number of philanthropic organizations that are not simply providing support for meritorious individual research, but actually making investments in the development of novel drugs that would not have been developed otherwise. And Kaleido is a good example of the investment by the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation being pivotal in developing a new and highly effective drug being brought to the market that would not have happened without that investment. So really changing the mindset and working more effectively together is what's going to change the next 5 years.
Good stuff. Right. Better for women, you get the last
Yeah,
word.
better for women. Okay, thank you, gentlemen. So I would say we're gonna stop the nonsense, and we're actually gonna do what needs to be done for real. We're not just kidding this time after however many meetings we all go to and talk about this stuff. So ideally, I think we would bring social media. So we would have patients online talking about their experiences and their outcomes, and then we would turn that into the conversation and the framework around unmet need and therapeutic burden. patient groups will actually stop fighting each other, and we will pool resources and we will fund collective efforts that involve academia and industry, because we start to understand that translation goes from discovery all the way to post-market, but we all need to work together to create a system. Our industry sponsors are going to start sharing data, and they are also going to share it with patients, because we've had enough and we're not taking it anymore. How's that?
I think it's a great call to action and a lot of things to look forward to as we come together next year and over the course of years, when I think this topic will still remain vital to the conversation. It's been my pleasure and my privilege to bring this topic to you, and I can assure you that Faster Cures is in the thick of this topic. We have a number of programs that I'm privileged to work on that are looking at patient centricity, the patient's assessment of benefits and risks, how patient perspectives can feed into the reimbursement environment. And I think the agreement is there that this is the right thing to do, and now we just need to find the tools for all of us to do it together. And thank you all for choosing this panel and for your time and attention this afternoon, and to my panelists for a great discussion today.